Well, good morning, everybody. We'll start a minute early. First of all, does everybody have a copy of today's handout? It looks like an outline that's not filled out. Okay. If you don't, we've got plenty. So now I also wanted to mention that I still have the overall outline for the class. It's just because we missed a week, all the dates are a week behind. You'll have to slide them down a week in your mind. But if you want to know what's coming up week by week, I'm going to leave these up here, and you're more than welcome to grab one when class is over. And you may be able to tell, I've been fighting that virus that's been going around, and right now I'm getting by with cough drops and coffee. And let me tell you, those are two tastes that do not go well together. But hopefully it'll keep the coughing down long enough to get through class. And if you look up at the screen, I ran across this yesterday, and this is, honest to goodness, this is an abstract of a legitimate scientific article published in a medical journal. Read what it says. Oreo cookies lowered cholesterol better than statins did. Oh, good. Well, you know, I texted this article to my sons yesterday and said I'm starting a new cholesterol drug. And my older one immediately texted back and said, "You've been on it for years." So apparently I've raised a smart aleck. I don't know where he gets that. But anyway, I just thought that was important to share this morning, just, you know. And I figured that you know, the only sensible, reasonable thing to do is to not take chances. So we'll be stopping at Walmart for supply on the way home. I didn't bring this morning, but I saw another thing this week. It showed a package of Oreos, and you know, you open it up, there's 3 lines of cookies, right? So the middle line was missing. And it says, at my age, this is doing a line. So anyway, all right. This morning we're going to talk some about Eli's sons, and you may be wondering why in a class about Samuel we're talking about Eli's sons. We need to understand why there was a need for Samuel, why God needed to raise up Samuel to become a priest and a prophet, and it all goes back to the corruption of the high priesthood under Eli's family. So let's go to chapter 2, and we'll dive in around verse 12. Now, the sins of Eli's sons. There were rules for sacrifice and how the priest got a share of the sacrifice. Now, you may be wondering, why did the priest get a share? Anybody got an answer for that? Why would the priest get a share of every sacrifice at the temple? Pardon? It was their pay, but why did they need that? God didn't provide anybody else pay like that. They worked at the temple, which means they did not do what? They didn't have farm. If you read very carefully when God assigns the inheritances for all the tribes and so on, guess who doesn't get to inherit any land? The priests. Because they were to serve at the tabernacle and later the temple, wherever the Ark of the Covenant was. They were to serve there. Their focus was to be on serving the Lord there and teaching the law to the people. So they didn't have farms. They couldn't raise crops. How are they going to make it? Well, they got, if you pardon the expression, they got a cut of most of the sacrifices, and that they either ate it or, you know, since it was meat and meat was rare, they could trade it for other goods and so on. I wouldn't be surprised if they got a cut of maybe some of the grain offerings and so on as well. We're not told that specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's the way it worked. But the priest's living came by receiving a portion of some of the sacrifices. And I say some because there were a few sacrifices that were wholly consumed. But like we talked about last week, most of them were not, and of those, the priest got a share. So, in Leviticus chapter 7, we're told this is the way it's supposed to work, starting in verse 30. With their own hands, they are to present the food offering to the Lord. They are to bring the fat together with the breast and wave the breast before the Lord as a wave offering. The priest shall burn the fat on the altar, but the breast belongs to Aaron and his sons. And you are to give the right thigh of your fellowship offerings to the priest as a contribution, and so on and so on. So there were specific portions of the sacrificial animal that were supposed to go to the priest. Now, if you read in 1 Samuel chapter 2, you'll find out already that the practice had changed. What the custom, it says, was, so they were doing things their way instead of God's way already, but the custom was that the portion was offered to God, and then the rest of it was boiled in a pot. And they would take a big old fork and stick it in, and whatever came out on the fork was the priest's share. Now, that might be a hunk of gristle, right? Or it could be a roast. You just never knew. But at least it was quote unquote fair. Well, Eli's sons decided that wasn't good enough for them. They put their own desires, their own wants before God. Remember a little while ago I preached about sin, and I mentioned that in every sin there comes a moment where you put your desires ahead of God's. Well, that's pretty clearly what Eli's sons were doing. Look at verse 15 of 1 Samuel 2. Even before the fat was burned, the fat is the Lord's portion, right? So even before the Lord's portion was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person sacrificing, give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw. And if the person, the worshiper, said to him, well, let the fat be burned first, give the Lord his portion first, and then take what you want, the servant would say, no, hand it over, and if you don't, I'll take it by force. So they were putting themselves just blatantly before God, their desires before God's, and actually taking the Lord's portion. And in doing so, you know what else they were doing? They were in effect causing the person who came to worship to sin. Because he was no longer giving the Lord's portion to the Lord, was he? He was giving it to the priest. Now, the priests were making him, but still he was involved in it. The rabbis discussed a lot of things over the centuries, and one of the things that they talked about was who was the most evil man in the Old Testament. And according to the rabbis, the most evil man was Jeroboam, the first one, who took the 10 tribes away from Solomon's son Rehoboam and set up his own kingdom. And you remember Jeroboam put golden calves in 2 temples, one up north and one down in Samaria toward the south. And all the northern kingdom worshipped the golden calves at those locations. And the Bible says that in doing so, he caused Israel to sin. Jeroboam, quote, caused Israel to sin. And according to the rabbis, that's what made him the most evil man in the Old Testament. He didn't just sin himself, he caused Israel to sin. That's what Eli's sons are doing here. They're not just sinning themselves, they're involving the nation in the sin and making the nation go along with their sin. Now, this all kind of reminds me in some ways of the story of Nadab and Abihu. Do you remember them back in Leviticus chapter 10? Aaron was the first high priest, and he had 2 older sons, Nadab and Abihu, and the 3rd son, Eleazar, the 4th son, Ithamar. Nadab and Abihu, on one occasion, and apparently they were drunk, because after this episode is over, the Lord gives specific instructions to Aaron and his sons to never serve at the temple after drinking wine. So the assumption kind of is that Nadab and Abihu were at least tipsy. But they took fire from a source that God had not authorized and used that fire to make offering to God. Do you remember what happened? They were struck dead on the spot. And the sin was so grave that Aaron and his family were told, you may not mourn them. You don't tear your robes as a sign of mourning. You don't wear sackcloth and ashes. You don't do all the typical things that people do to show their grief. You can't mourn them because their sin was blasphemy against God. They were supposed to be sober and offer sacrifice and teach the law to the people. If you look down at verses 10 and 11 of Leviticus chapter 10, it says, they are to distinguish between the holy and the common, between the clean and unclean, and teach the Israelites all the decrees the Lord had given them through Moses. That's what the priests were supposed to do. Officiate at the temple and teach the law to the people. Nadab and Abihu didn't do it. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they weren't doing it either. They were failing. And beyond not doing their job, they were choosing to sin by stealing the sacrifice that belonged to God. Now, look over Numbers for just a moment. Numbers chapter 15. Numbers chapter 15. This is a concept that's always kind of fascinated me. Numbers 15, and we'll start in verse 27. Oops, I'm sorry, I've tapped in the wrong chapter. Numbers 15 and verse 27. If one person sins unintentionally, that person must bring a year-old female goat for a sin offering. The priest is to make atonement before the Lord for the one who erred by sinning unintentionally, and when atonement has been made, that person will be forgiven. One and the same law applies to everyone who sins unintentionally, whether a native-born Israelite or a foreigner residing among you. Now, God apparently recognized that there are things about the law that could be difficult to keep, and you might unintentionally transgress one of the holiness laws, for example, the clean and unclean kind of things. And if that happens and you make sacrifice, you'll be forgiven. You didn't intend to sin. Now look at the next verse. But anyone who sins, now the NIV translates this defiantly. Some of you may have something else I'll get to in just a second. If anyone sins defiantly, whether native born or foreigner, blasphemes the Lord, they blaspheme the Lord and must be cut off from the people of Israel. The Hebrew there actually says, if anyone sins with a high hand. Interesting phrase. Sin with a high hand. It means you do it deliberately, on purpose, with forethought. Chris, is the legal phrase malice intent? Close? I'm not a lawyer. I just like to know, like to read about it. But you do something with malicious intent. You know it's wrong, and you do it anyway. It says they will be cut off. That likely means execution. Be cut off from the people. At the very best, they're going to be expelled and banished from the people because they've sinned against the Lord deliberately. Well, think back to what Hophni and Phinehas were doing, Eli's sons. Does that sound intentional to you? Defiant? Sin with a high hand? And these are priests. And realize that when Eli dies, one of them is in line to be the high priest. I'm not sure which one was older, but one of them is going to be the high priest. And look at their behavior and the example they're giving. Now, it makes me ask the question, well, how'd they get that way? Good chance they weren't raised too well, because we'll find out here in just a little bit that Eli actually shared in the fruit of their sin. He is rebuked for failing to rebuke them when they needed it. So Eli very likely wasn't the best father, but I kind of think too that some of it has to do with the nature of power. You may have heard the second of these two quotes on the screen, that power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. You've heard that one? Well, Lord Acton was actually paraphrasing an older statement from William Pitt, the elder. Unlimited power is apt to corrupt the minds of those who possess it. You ever seen someone get power, even on a small scale, and it goes to their head? I mean, have you ever heard, for example, of a prison guard who's abusive towards prisoners just because he can? You know, it doesn't have to be a lot of power. Some people are not able to handle power. Think about the power of the priesthood in Israel. Could that go to someone's head? Seemed like it could. And I think that's part of what happened here with Hophni and Phinehas. The power went to their head and they began to abuse the position they'd been given. Now, that leads me to a question. How do we prevent our leaders from turning to sin? How do we keep the leaders in this church from abusing their power? Now, I need to stop at this point and make a disclaimer. We haven't been here that long, so I don't know much history of this church. I don't have a lot of insight to this church, so anything that I'm about to say does not apply to this church. Okay, I'm not passing a value judgment on the leadership here. I'm talking in general terms, although I am going to give a couple examples that I know from previous experience, nothing to do with here, okay? I don't want anybody to think that I'm bad-mouthing the elders here because I have nothing but respect and admiration for what I've seen so far. But I don't know enough to be making any kind of judgment here. Okay? But how do we make sure that our leaders don't turn to sin? Well, the first thing is you got to choose the right kind of guy in the first place. You realize that in the New Testament there is no mechanism for removing an elder? There isn't. We're never told how to remove someone from that position, just how to appoint them to that position. And you know, if you've been in Chris's class in 1 Timothy and in Titus both, Paul goes on at great length about the kind of person who should become an elder. Literally should be the best among us. And I'm not sure we've always done that. 40 years ago, the church my in-laws went to had a split. I never knew all the reasons, don't care to know all the reasons, none of my business. I do know that things finally came to a head when one of the elders slugged a deacon in the foyer of the church building after a contentious business meeting. I'm not making that up. That happened. Now, let me tell you just briefly about this elder. He was a successful businessman, and I think that's why he was chosen. He was a big, burly man, and the one thing I remember about him is that I didn't like shaking hands with him. You know why? He's one of these guys that's got to break your bones every time he shakes your hand. And I've never understood that. That's a dominance move. That is nothing but petty dominance. And I don't think that's what an elder ought to be about. I think there were warning signs before he was appointed an elder that were ignored. Because clearly he wasn't the right kind of person to be an elder. If he could allow his anger to control him to the point that he would slug a deacon in the foyer of the church building. I'm not saying it'd been better outside the foyer of the church building. Okay, but in some ways, to me, being inside the building, doesn't that kind of make it worse in some ways? Maybe shouldn't have been an elder in the first place. We have to make sure that the right kind of people become leaders. I know another church where the preacher has made diversity his God. And I mean diversity as it's defined politically. The only thing that counts is skin color and gender and so on and so on. Now, the problem with that is a lot of the acceptance that's preached in the name of diversity goes against the Word of God, doesn't it? Yet he has made diversity his God. And as it turned out, there were warning signs along the way that nobody paid much attention to. And that church is hurting. Just about everybody, and it's a pretty large church when we attended there. And just about everybody whose names I knew, because in a church that big, you didn't know everybody. But just about everybody that I knew no longer goes there, including half of the eldership. Warning signs along the way. Intervention should have happened. Didn't. And now that church, instead of being a light to the community, is suffering. You got to make sure that the right kind of person is put into place. And then, I don't know, you could overemphasize the importance of prayer before the person's selected, during the selection, and constantly after the selection. If you don't pray for our elders and deacons and the minister, if you don't pray for them constantly, you're missing something. You're missing something. It's part of how we can protect them by asking God to protect them. Folks, they're subject to the same kind of temptations that tripped up Eli's sons Hophni and Phinehas. Maybe nothing to do specifically with sacrifice, but there are all kinds of opportunities for elders to do things, elders and deacons to do things that are not proper if they had a mind to. We need to pray they never get a mind to. So pray constantly. And then one more thing. We need to be willing to confront sin. In Galatians chapter 6, Paul tells us, if any one of you is overtaken in trespass, you who are spiritual should restore him gently. I'm not sure we do that. We don't want to get involved with someone else's problems. We don't want to get involved in someone else's life. We don't want to be judgmental. Well, you know, if a brother or sister is overtaken in a sin, you know it and you don't do anything, you know what you're doing? You are enabling, but it's not just that. You're waving bye-bye as they walk down the road to hell. Right? If the sin is not ended and repented of, what's the destination, folks? I'm not trying to be judgmental here. I'm just saying this is the way, that's the truth. If you really care, you'll pull somebody aside and say, brother, we need to talk. Sister, we need to sit down and spend some time together. And you know something? In 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul actually tells Timothy, the youngish preacher, that he needs to call out elders who sin. Interesting. It doesn't say remove them from office. It just confront them with their sin so that they'll repent and then they can go on. Because elders are human, right? Will they sin? Sure. That's not the question. The question is, will they repent and keep on following God? And Timothy is told that he is to call out elders who rebuke elders who sin. Now, I'm not encouraging people to, we don't need to rebuke the elder booth in the foyer or anything like that. But if things get serious enough in someone's life, we need to make sure that there's an intervention so that the sin can be addressed, repented of, and then we move on. Yes, sir.
Mike, I just wonder, those three men, godly men, Aaron, Eli, Samuel, and I can see this even in the world today, but sometimes as a dad, which these three men were, could have devoted themselves and thrown themselves so much into the work that they failed to do what God requires us of, is take care of our family. And each one of those men had sons that turned out bad.
Yeah.
Sin. So it makes you just wonder if they were all dedicated to God, but did they get so dedicated to the work that they failed the responsibility that God calls us to raising our family?
It's an excellent point. Jerry's pointing out that Aaron, father of Nadab and Abihu, Eli, father of Hophni and Phinehas, and then Samuel, I forget the names of his sons, but all three of them were priests, high priests. Samuel also a prophet. All three served God. They were the quote-unquote ministers of their era. And all three of them had kids that went bad. And he's asking, is it possible that they threw themselves so much into their ministry that they ignored their family? And I think, yeah. The answer is, it's entirely possible that happened. Don't we see that nowadays? I mean, how many of you known a preacher's kid that you just as soon not come over to your house? I mean, it's almost a cliche, isn't it? Of course, you know why preacher's kids are so bad? Because they hang around with the elders and deacons' kids. Now, I pray that never becomes the case here, but we've got to make sure that when we're praying, maybe one of the things we ought to pray for is that the elders and the deacons and the preacher take the time to be fathers in their own homes. And that actually comes before their church service, because it should, shouldn't it? It should. Right, yeah, they've got to have families who are governed correctly before they become elders and deacons. So yeah, that's even more proof that the family should come first. So we don't ever want to burden a man so much that he feels like he's got no time for his own kids. And I know churches that have done that, seen it. You have too. Let's make sure we don't. Let's make sure we pray that doesn't become the case. All right, verse 25. One more thing here before we move on to Samuel being called. Look at verse 25. Eli finally talked to his kids because he knew they'd been ripping off the sacrifice. He knew they'd been sleeping with the women who served at the tabernacle. And we don't know any more than that, okay? I don't want to say that there was an Old Testament order of nuns, because that sounds like way too much organization for what appears to. But it appears to be that there were some women who chose not to have families but to serve God at the tabernacle. And we don't know any more than that. So anything else is sheer speculation. But anyway, Hophni and Phinehas were abusing those women by forcing them to sleep with them because they were the priests. They were the big dogs in the situation. So Eli finally confronts them, and he says, if one man sins against another, the Lord can set that right. But if a man sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? And then it says, they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. Don't read that as that God had wanted them to die. I think it's more along the lines of God had pronounced judgment upon them. He pronounced the sentence upon them. Okay? And it's possible to wander so far from God that you will not come back. Now catch that. Hear what I said? That you will not come back. Not that you cannot come back, but that you will not come back. Those are different things, aren't they? As far as God's concerned, you're always welcome to come back. But you can wander so far from Him that you won't do it. And that's on you. You remember the story in Exodus where Moses is trying to get the Pharaoh to let the people go, and we're told 10 or 12 times that Pharaoh hardened his heart, and another 10 or 12 times that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, which is it? Well, God does what God does, and it affects different people in different ways. How come? Because of your heart, your nature. God's love can drive some people away while it pulls other people to him. There's a Russian proverb that says, the same water that softens the potato hardens the egg. The presence, the grace, the love, the mercy, the justice of God draws some people to him. Other people see that and it hardens them. And I don't know why they choose that, but they do. Pharaoh did. And apparently Hophni and Phinehas had gotten to the point that that's what they were choosing. So God was going to allow them to die. He pronounced judgment. Their sins were so great that they needed to die. More about that in just a minute. All right. Now, the end of chapter 2, God rejects Eli's household. He sends a prophet, a man of God, to Eli, basically says, I chose you and I chose your family, I chose you, I gave you all the advantages, I made you my priest, and look what you've done with it. I want you to notice, if you would, where is it here? Look at verse 29. Why then do you scorn, talking to Eli, why do you scorn my sacrifices, my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest part of every offering of my people Israel? So Hophni and Phinehas may have been stealing the Lord's offering, but who was eating it? Eli's eating it, even though he knows he has no right to it. And he knows where it came from and how it was achieved, but he's taking part in it. So, long story short is, the man of God tells Eli, I'm going to remove your family, and I'm going to raise up someone new. That's how God responds to corrupt leadership. Removal and raising up. The corrupt is removed and someone else is raised up. You see that multiple times in Judges through 2 Chronicles. People would become corrupt. What leadership they had was corrupt. God would raise up a judge, and then after a while, either he would become corrupt or the people would become corrupt again. They'd be persecuted. They'd suffer, and then another one would be raised up. Then, and you go on through the kings. You have a king who maybe starts good, like Saul, right? But Saul became corrupt, and what happened to him? He was removed, and David was raised up in his stead. And it goes on and on and on and on and on like that all through. I mean, it's almost like a broken record, you know? It just never ends. Somebody becomes corrupt, God removes him, and a new one is raised up. That's God's answer. Well, how does God go about the removing and replacement? I find this kind of interesting. The removal part is usually pretty loud. God's making a statement. He wants his people to notice and see what he's doing. Here's how Hophni and Phinehas died. The Philistines were oppressing the Israelites, as they usually did, and it had come to battle again, as it frequently did. And so Hophni and Phinehas decided, the next time we fight the Philistines, we're going to take the Ark of the Covenant, we're going to take it out of the tabernacle, and we're going to carry it before the army like a good luck charm. Because if we got that in front of us, we can't lose. You want to guess what happened? They lost. The ark was captured by the Philistines. Hophni and Phinehas were killed. A runner came home to announce what had happened. Eli heard it and fell over and broke his neck. You think that story got around? You see what I mean about God does something, that he makes noise? You remember Ahab and Jezebel in the Old Testament, right? Jezebel was so bad that from that time on, no one has named their child Jezebel. Think about it. You ever known a lady named Jezebel? I've known a couple of dogs named Jezebel, but no women. Nobody wants that name. Remember how she died? when God finally removed Ahab and Jezebel from the scene? Her servants tossed her out a window, and she fell to her death, and dogs ate her carcass. You think that story got around? See, when God removes, he does it in a manner that people notice, and there's a French legal phrase that actually explains it. There's a French phrase. High school French was too long ago, so I'm not going to try to pronounce that. What it means is for the encouragement of others. In French law, sometimes sentences are passed not just because you deserve it, but as an example to everybody else for the encouragement of others. Well, when I talk about the story of Hophni and Phinehas and Eli getting around, when I talk about the story of Jezebel getting around, that's for the encouragement of others, so that everyone can see what happens when you become corrupt and God has to remove you. And then something to notice about the raising someone up. The replacement for the corrupt leader is frequently someone you would not expect. Jephthah was raised up in the book of Judges, and he was the son of a prostitute. The last person a good Israelite would choose to lead them. Saul became corrupt, and he was removed. Who was raised up? Teenage kid named David. He was so unlikely that when Samuel, who was at his house to anoint him, when Samuel saw him, what was Samuel's reaction? Can't be this kid. There's got to be somebody else. The last person that Samuel would have been looking for. Or look at Samuel himself. Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas are rejected. They're removed from the scene. And who gets raised up? A little boy named Samuel. I don't think anybody was expecting that either. And there's a lesson, I think, for us in there as well. When someone begins to rise up into leadership, don't be too quick to reject him because he's not one of us. He doesn't come from the right family. Have you seen his background? I'm just not so sure. You don't need to be asking who he is. You need to be asking, is God doing this? Because God will work through the most unlikely, unexpected, undesired of people. He chooses who he wills. All right, so now we get down chapter 3, the first part. The Lord actually calling Samuel. Now, you've all heard the story. It's a staple in children's Bible classes of Daniel being called at night. He's gone to bed, and he hears a voice, Samuel, Samuel. He gets up and rushes to the old man and says, yes, Master, what do you need? And Eli says, I didn't call you. And so this happens like 3 times, and finally Eli realizes it's God. And he says, next time you hear the voice, you say, speak, Lord, your servant hears. And so Samuel does. And the Lord tells him what the man of God has already told Eli. That he actually tells Samuel, I'm fixing to do something that's going to make the ears tingle of everyone who hears it. In other words, the removal is going to be something people will notice. But he tells them, I'm going to remove Eli and his family because they become corrupt. Well, the next morning, Eli asked him what message the Lord had for him. And Samuel is reluctant to tell him, understandably, right? Eli is his master. Samuel's still just a kid. And Samuel's been told that Eli and his family are going the way of the dodo. And Eli tells him, don't be afraid. Tell me whatever he said. And so Samuel tells him. And then Eli's response, look at verse 18. It strikes me, I don't exactly know how to take this. Samuel told him everything, hid nothing from him, and Eli said, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. I don't know if this is fatalism, what one author called resigned acceptance. He's God, he's going to do what he wants to do. Or I want to think it's a statement of faith. That maybe this is the better side of Eli, maybe hearkening back to when he was younger and not corrupt, saying, it's the Lord. I live to serve him. Let him do what he wants. Let him do what he will do. I don't know exactly which way to take it. But Eli does understand that Samuel has heard the same message the man of God told him. They're identical. So Eli knows that this message is from God, and that it's going to happen. Now look at verse 19. Let's read the last 3 verses here. Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. In other words, Samuel began to function as a prophet, and everything that he said was true. That's part of the test. If you look in the law, that's part of the test for a prophet. Is his word true or not? Well, all of Samuel's words were true. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord, and the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Samuel's reputation started when he received the same message about Eli's house that the man of God had previously spoken. Since they were the same message, Eli and everyone else knew that word was from God. And then God continues to speak to him. And you get I get a sense here that there's been a hunger in Israel for hearing the word of the Lord. Because when the leadership is corrupt, as it had been, how can God speak? There's no one there that can honestly take the word and give it on to the people. So they respond when they find out that Samuel actually is speaking for the Lord. I get the sense that people start to come to him for guidance, start to come to him for leadership, that even before he becomes the high priest, his reputation is being established. It reminds me a little bit about Luke chapter 2, verse 52, where we're told that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and men, all that leading toward Jesus' ministry. Well, Samuel grew in size, grew in reputation as he spoke for the Lord more and more. And you get the feeling here that God is raising him up, preparing him for a greater ministry, which we know from the rest of the book is what's fixing to come. All right, that's it for this week. I appreciate your comments and attention. And let's see, next week? Yes, next week is chapter 7. Samuel begins to function as a judge or leader of Israel.